Hi, everybody. Welcome to CMN 201, the social impact of mass media, the horror film and media and popular culture. My name is Lillian Ruiz, and I am the instructor for this class. And normally I would be teaching this class in person, but there is nothing normal, as we know, about the current time that we are in. So this class is being offered online asynchronously, which means that there are no required Zoom meetings. But what I want to try to do is to duplicate as much as possible as what I would be doing if we were meeting in class. So to that end, you can see at the top of our Moodle page, there are several sections there. And one section that I wanted to draw your attention to right now is entitled Syllabus and Other Documents. And in that section, you can see that I've uploaded our syllabus and our course outline. This would be the handout that I would be distributing on the first day of class, because on the first day of class, what I would be doing is basically just giving you an overview of what the semester is about. And then we would begin to start talking about horror film as the semester progresses. So you can see that if you're looking at the syllabus, I've got my name listed there, Lillian Ruiz. That's usually one of the first questions I get is, what should I call you? And I'm pretty informal. Most people call me Lillian. I like to have an informal, flexible class, but call me whatever you feel comfortable with. You can see my phone number is there, as well as my email, and my email is just my surname, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. Because when I started at GCC 28 years ago, believe it or not, email was still in its infancy. So when we were given email addresses, they were based on just the surname and not the first initial, until it was discovered that was not a very efficient way of going about doing things. So an email address can give you some information about how long somebody's been at GCC. And I was hired for English classes. I'm an English professor, but as the years have gone on, I've spread out, and I also teach public speaking, and I teach media classes, which is part of what this particular class happens to be. And I've always been a fan of horror film ever since I was very young. So it's one of the reasons why I've constructed this class with this particular theme, which I will talk about. And I hope too that you are a fan of horror film. I've oftentimes said that you need to have the right temperament to take this class. The idea is that we are going to be watching horror films and discussing them, and if that's going to cause you distress, then this is not the class you should be taking. But there are a group of people who really enjoy watching horror films, and I tend to be one of them, and I suspect you are as well. And one of the things we need to do at the beginning of the semester is to talk about why so many people, or at least some people, take enjoyment from this genre. But at any rate, you can see that I do have, in addition to my email, some optional opportunities for you to interact with me and your classmates. There is an optional Moodle chat room, and that'll be every Monday from 1:30 to 2. And there will be an optional Moodle Zoom, and that'll be every Wednesday from 1:30 to 2. So I'll be there in that chat room or Zoom, and certainly you are free to drop in or not, and your classmates are free to drop in or not. Anybody who's there, we can have a kind of conversation if you so wanted to. I don't have technical office hours outside of our optional chat room and Zoom, but you can always make an appointment with me at any point, whether you wanted to meet via Zoom or chat room or telephone. I want to be as flexible as possible. So the textbooks, and there has been some academic scholarship done about horror film, and we are going to be reading some of that academic scholarship. It's one of the reasons why this is a 200 level class, or a more advanced class. That's how you can tell. Introductory class starts with the number 1, and a more advanced class starts with the number 2. And the 3 texts that I've chosen: Projected Fears, Horror Film in American Culture by Phillips, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue by Madry, and Horror Film: A Critical Introduction, Leader. Now, the difficulty with these particular texts is I have not been able to find them for free online because of copyright issues. So what that means is that you are going to have to purchase these texts or rent them or find used copies of them at one point or another. The good news is that ultimately these texts are meant to supplement our own class conversations and our own viewing experience. So I'm not saying that you don't need the text. Yes, you do. But what I'm saying is that certainly as you are in the process of getting texts, you can manage without those particular texts. If any of you happen to find any of these texts online, please let me know. I've searched and haven't been able to find them at all. What I do have as a note is that it's assumed that you'll have a good dictionary at the source for reference, because we'll be doing some writing in class. I put that note on all of my syllabi, regardless of the course I'm teaching. And I'm well aware that you probably have access on your cell and your computer, but having access and using a dictionary, which can do more than just provide a spelling or a definition, can actually give you the etymology or the word history. And a thesaurus, which can provide synonyms or words with similar meanings, like cheap and frugal, for instance, or perhaps antonyms, opposites, like hot and cold. So those are useful resources. Course description. This is an in-depth focus analysis of a specific theme or topic in mass media. And I also teach an introduction to mass media class. I usually teach it in the summer, where it's an overview of what mass media is. And we talk about things like books and magazines and newspapers and television and film and internet, and basically all of the different ways that media has developed over our society and how it's impacted our society. And you can see that I've listed some media here: film, TV, print, music, and video games. And what I wanted to do after this introductory class was to have a class that was focused on a particular element of media. Again, I had indicated that I am a great fan of horror films, but that was not the original incarnation of this class. The original incarnation of this class, which you might have heard of, the theme was zombies in media and popular culture. This was when basically the zombie mania, if you want to think about it that way, was at its height, when The Walking Dead was #1 television program. It even beat Monday Night Football in terms of the ratings at the time. And Harvard actually started a class in zombies that had initially given me the idea. But as with everything, zombies fell out of favor, and horror film seems to be much more general and perhaps a much more thorough way of sort of examining media and popular culture, because it's not just defined to one tiny genre. So that's where we are now with this class, and as long as it remains popular, we will continue on with horror film, and then when it's no longer popular, shift to a new theme. Basically, regardless of what the theme is, it allows us to examine social and cultural issues, things like race and class and gender. Media is a wonderful lens to truly understand a society. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Frank Luntz. He happens to be a political analyst, and he works with language. He's very good with crafting language to help persuade audiences of particular perspectives. He actually was the one that came up with the term war on terror rather than the Iraqi war, arguing that a war on terror would get more buy-in from the general public than Iraqi war, and he was right about that. The reason why I mention his name is because he argues that to truly understand a populace and a society, as much as they indicate that they want to be evaluated based on their education and their intellect, it's really their emotions and the way they spend their leisure time. And in other words, the media that surrounds them, because there is no way to escape media in our society, and the media which they consume. And I think it's very true in many respects. It's one of the reasons why I've become more and more interested in media as the years have gone by. So basically, there is a prerequisite for this course because it is a 200 level course. The prerequisite is English 101, or what we call Composition 1 at GCC. In other words, you've had a class where you've talked about how to write a paper. So you've already got some background with writing and analysis. If you think you don't have that prerequisite, please let me know and we can talk about what your options are. The recommended class for this course is Media and Popular Culture, that I indicated that I teach in the summertime, but it's not required. So if you haven't taken the introductory media class, you can certainly take this class. And I've had students do things backwards, where they take this class first and then they end up taking the introductory media class just because they want to consider media in greater depth. Under learning outcomes, you can see that I've written that as a result of successfully completing this course, students will be able to summarize scholarship of various mass media to understand mass media's academic relevance. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Media Foundation, which is housed in Northampton and connected with UMass Amherst. It's one of the leading areas of study for examining mass media. So we happen to live in an area that's very rich with media studies. Number 2, recognize and articulate symbolic and metaphoric meanings in various mass media, so to improve critical thinking skills. And once we start talking about symbols and metaphors, it sounds very much like an English class, because basically a film can very much serve like a text. In other words, it can be read literally, but it can also be interpreted, and it can have multiple levels of meaning. And that's what we're going to talk about, at least with the horror films that we are watching over the course of this semester. And there is a component of actually watching in addition to discussing and writing about, which I'll talk about in a moment. And critical thinking skills, it's something that I put on all of my syllabi. And it's not about criticism so much as it is about asking questions and analyzing and interpreting. Probably the best question, and it's one that toddlers know quite well, is why? And it's a very complex question, I can say. And I oftentimes say that's the difference between high school, which is where you learn what, and college, where you begin to grapple with the why. But our job is to watch these horror films and to try to see what possible symbolic and metaphoric meanings they might have in terms of understanding our society. We do want to analyze and identify the cultural significance of mass media so we can understand its influence on our society. We'll gather and appraise examples of various mass media to identify some of the cultural and social anxieties in our society, because that is part of what horror film does, is that examines social and cultural anxiety, just not necessarily in an overt way. Explain in oral and written form the uses, meanings, and popularity of mass media, so to improve oral and written communication skills. And I always have that on all of my syllabi about improving oral and written communication skills, regardless of the class I teach. Understand and draw connections between mass media and oneself, others, and society at large, so to examine mass media's social, political, and cultural influence. Evaluate and interpret data on the use and popularity of various mass media, so to improve analytic skills. And examine social issues such as race, class, and gender portrayed in various mass media, so to better understand such issues within our own society. So the procedures, or the way that I'm going to be doing this class, you can see that I'm going to be posting a video of myself, much like I'm posting this particular video now, discussing class material. And I'll be posting this video at the time in which our class would normally meet, and that would be on Wednesday at 6 p.m. So you can expect that every Wednesday at 6 p.m. there would be a class video. That said, I will probably post it before 6 p.m., but certainly by 6 p.m. it would be there. And then you have 24 hours in which to watch that video and to answer a corresponding attendance question for that particular video. And that's what basically will serve as class attendance, if you will, for the class. And if you need an extension more than 24 hours to answer that question, please ask me. I'll be happy to grant it to you, especially during these difficult times. Your answer on the discussion form is your attendance for that particular class. And you're not required to respond to any of your classmates' comments. That said, I am asking that you read what everybody has written, because that'll give you a sense of what we would have talked about in class if we were all together. Any additional interactions you have with your classmates in the discussion forum, think of it as kind of like participation, similar to participating in a live class when you might raise your hand. And I know that some students learn best by participating, others learn best by listening. So it's up to you to decide how much or how little you want to interact with that form. But you do want to answer the attendance question for that week, and you do want to read the responses for myself and your classmates. And then as I indicated, I'll have an optional class chat session on Mondays, 1:30 to 2, an optional Zoom class session on Wednesdays from 1:30 to 2. No penalty for not attending these sessions. Think of it as another opportunity for participation. And then any written assignments you have, and I'll be talking about these in a moment, you'll have journals, papers, and a final exam. And we'll talk about all of them more in depth as the semester progresses. Would be submitted to my email, which is again ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, via PDF, which would allow me to write comments on it with my grading program and then return it back to you. I realize I'm giving you a whole lot of information at once, and I don't expect you to remember all of this. What I wanted to do today is just to basically give you an overview of the semester as a whole, and then we could revisit those pieces that are applicable to the course as they become relevant. You can see that, just generally speaking, you're expected to complete all reading and writing assignments by the due dates, and students will submit periodic journal entries discussing their reactions to the various media. And that will be under the journal section that I'll talk about in a moment. And there will also be a final course project, some project that allows you to analyze something much more in depth about media. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as well as a final exam. And the final exam will be an essay exam, but it will be open book, open notes, and you'll have 24 hours in which to take that examination. So if you are a returning student to GCC, you probably are familiar with the Institutional Services Disability Statement, but I thought it bore repeating that Greenfield Community College values inclusion and equal access to its programs and activities, and is committed to fostering an environment of respect and full participation. Our goal is to create learning environments that are equitable, inclusive, and welcoming. If there are aspects of the instruction or design of this course that results in barriers to your inclusion or accurate assessment or achievement, please notify me, the instructor, as soon as possible. If you are a student with a disability and may need reasonable academic accommodations, please contact the Office of Disability Services. And you can see there that there's information about their webpage and also their contact phone number. And I also wanted to mention the GCC Wellness Center. And as you can see in the blurb there, the first sentence, these are challenging times. And that's probably the understatement of the day. If you're struggling for any reason and believe that this may impact your performance in this course, please contact our Learning Support Counselor, Kathleen Coe, in the GCC Wellness Center via email, and her information is there, or phone for support, resources, and or referrals. And that said, I wanted to thank you for taking a class during this incredibly challenging time, for having the fortitude and the strength and the ambition for doing so. It doesn't escape me how much you all have on your plates. So let me talk a little bit about Response Journal. And I had indicated that you're going to be doing informal responses about the films that we will be viewing and discussing in class. And that's what I'm calling a Response Journal. And I'll read the blurb and then I'll explain a little bit more. The response journals are meant as an opportunity for students to analyze media. The guidelines very informal. Each student should use the journals as an opportunity to explore the media in the way he or she feels would be most beneficial. That said, I might give some suggestions in class, or perhaps the class attendance question might inspire you. But on the whole, journals should reflect whatever relevant thoughts or questions, and sometimes the questions are more important than the answers, that the individual student has about a particular form of media. And for us, that'll be a particular horror film. The journals will also provide an excellent opportunity to brainstorm and free write project topics. And I'm going to distribute topics that you could pursue for your final project, but you're also free to create your own. So you can begin thinking right now about that. And as long as you get it approved by me, then ultimately you could pursue that as your final project more in depth. And also final exam questions. Not that you can write your own final exam question, but you might be able to anticipate what some of the questions are on the final, if you think about the way the class is constructed and what's been emphasized. Journals will be graded informally. I'm not going to be grading for grammar or mechanics, basically just content. Think of it as a kind of conversation in paper. So an excellent would be a plus. I'm not using a letter grading system. I'm using a check system because it is informal. Excellent would be plus, a good would be a check plus, satisfactory would be a check. There also is a less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory, but most grades end up in the good area. Late journals will lower your grade by 1 full grade, and no late journal will be accepted after 1 week has elapsed, unless you've made other arrangements with me beforehand. What does that mean? Ask for an extension, and I'll be happy to give it to you. And I would normally do this if we were meeting in person, but especially now during these challenging times. So if you need additional time, just please ask me, and I will grant it to you. Please submit your journals via PDF to my email. And most journals are about a page or so long of reflections about a particular film that we would be studying in class. But the journals can be as long or as short as you think they need to be. I think it's always a good idea to, write about your thoughts right when you've actually viewed a film, when the ideas are still fresh, though some students prefer to wait until we've talked about it in class so that they can utilize some of that as well. And both are good, whatever system works best for you. Attendance, as I indicated, the way I'm going to try to duplicate or replicate attendance is that class activity and discussion is extremely important, cannot be made up. Absences and tardiness will be negatively reflected in your participation grade. So you'll have a participation question each week on Wednesday. And you would have 24 hours to respond to that. And again, if you need additional time, ask me. And while each case is different, anything more than one absence could lower your grade. So you are able to miss one attendance question and one film. And again, as I indicated, if it turns out that you need additional time, I could also grant you that as well. And you don't need to notify me if you're going to be absent for one class, but certainly if you're missing several, let me know what's happening. Consultations, you can meet with me during our chat room times, our Zoom times, or by appointment. The course project that I was indicating to you, the final course project is, for most of you, will be a written analysis of horror film in a particular mass medium. Although there is room for more creative approaches, and guidelines will be discussed in class. So while many of you will probably elect to write your traditional academic paper when you're analyzing an element of horror film, or perhaps a horror film in depth, some of you might want to do something a little bit more creative. I've had students that have created their own short horror films. So there are lots of different ways that you could go about this particular assignment. In other words, you can use media to present your results. So you can begin thinking, for those of you that have a creative bent, about different ways that you could perhaps go about a final course project, which will be due on the last day of class. So you've got the entire semester, but certainly early submissions are encouraged. One of the advantages is that if you hand in your final course project early enough, you might have the option to revise it for a higher grade, subject to my permission. You would need to submit in the original graded project along with the revision, but that is an option for you to consider. And while we are talking about rather holistically the idea of horror film, obviously we can't examine it in depth. So there might be a particular area that you would like to pursue in greater depth than we do in class, or a particular area you might want to examine that we don't even discuss in class. And that would be a wonderful opportunity for your final project. So if you are going to be submitting in text, it should be typed in double space, have 1-inch borders. I'm hopeful that this is what you discussed in terms of paper presentation and your English 101 class, but I will also be reviewing that when we get to that particular point. And please submit the final course project via PDF to my email. Again, I will skip the plagiarism section and then move to the grading section, which was the piece that you were probably most interested in. 10% is what I'm calling that participation, that you're watching the class videos, you're answering the class attendance question. And again, hopefully reading what your classmates have written, and if anything occurs to you that you would want to respond to, you certainly could. 30% are those journals where you will be writing about a 1-page response or so to each of the horror films we will be viewing and discussing in class. Graded informally, not for grammar or mechanics, just for content on a checkmark system. 30% is that final course project, which is due at the ending of the semester, where you're doing a more in-depth analysis about something about horror film, which perhaps you can rewrite if you submit it in early enough. And then 30% is the final exam, which is a cumulative essay exam, open book, open notes. And so you can utilize all of the resources that you've been utilizing during the semester as a whole. And you would have 24 hours in which to do that. And then I have at the bottom some criteria for essay examination for those, or for essay evaluation for those of you who are going to elect to submit in a final project that is a paper, and I can refer to that a little bit later. So that gives you a sense of the class in general. The specifics of the class is under the course outline, and that's also in the section in your Moodle area that says syllabus and other documents. Where dates and assignments, here's my disclaimer, may be subject to change, and also readings should be completed before the dates indicated below. And also pursuant to the character of the genre, some of the course material is graphic in nature. So I just want to make sure that everybody understood that. Today is purely introduction, so you can see week 1 on the 27th, it just says introduction, for me to review the syllabus and to give you a holistic sense of the semester. And then week 2, I've tried to basically give chapter headings, if you will, for each of the weeks. It's about horror, film, and fear. And if you can have read before the 3rd, next Wednesday, in Projected Fears, the introduction, and the text horror film, chapter 4, What is Horror? Chapter 5, Why of Horror? And chapter 6, Critics and Censors, that would be fantastic. That said, I'm aware that people still might be getting books. If we were meeting in person, I would tell you to try your best to have it read, but not to panic if you didn't have it read, because we could still proceed. I have a documentary that we will be also watching on that during that class that talks about basically what horror film is and why it appeals to individuals. And then we begin the class, as far as I'm concerned, on the 10th of February, because next week is basically just foundation and introduction to the genre. And we will talk about horror film in the 1920s. You can see that what I've done is I've selected a film from each decade, or I've tried to select a film from each decade that represents that decade and that culture in one way or another. And the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is usually considered to be the first horror film in 1920. So we will be watching that. It is a silent film, so it's a very different kind of film. Luckily, what I've been able to do is to find links for these films. If we were meeting in person, I would just play the DVD. That obviously is not going to be happening, but I have been fortunate enough to be able to find links for just about all of these so that you can watch them on your own. And some of you might actually even own some of these films. Certainly, if you've seen this film before, definitely watch it again, because as we will talk about next class, most people watch film for entertainment. They don't watch film carefully from an academic perspective. And much like literature, each time you view a film or each time you read a piece of literature, the more you're going to be able to see in it and the more interpretation you're going to be able to provide. So obviously the first viewing will be the beginning of your analysis. I understand you may not have time for multiple viewings for all of these films, but all of these films have more than just entertainment or shock value associated with them, or else we wouldn't be studying them in class. So it's the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and you can see that I've given some readings on the 10th of February that I'm hopeful you might have read before the 10th about the origins in film Gothic and genreification. Begins to talk about the early days of horror film. And then on the 17th of February, we're going to talk about horror film of the 1930s. And the 1930s was a very ripe time for horror film. But Dracula is the film that we are going to be examining with Bela Lugosi, 1931. And you can see the readings that I have scheduled on the 17th that I'm hopeful you can have read before you watch the film. Or at least shortly thereafter, on Dracula itself, studio horrors of the 1930s, Reality Bites, a little bit of a pun there, and on Todd Browning, who happens to be the director of Dracula, and also the director of Freaks, if you're familiar with that film. If not, we'll talk a little bit about that film and its significance when we get to February 17th. February 24th, And our next film to represent the 1940s would be Cat People. Probably not as well known as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Dracula, but a very important film and a very stylistic film, I might add. Asking you to read in our Nightmares book, Shadow Play, and in the horror film book, Chapter 2, 1939 to 1973. So that begins to talk about horror films from those time periods. Note on the 24th is when you would have your first journal due, and that would be on Dr. Caligari. So we would have had enough time to watch the film and to talk about the film in depth. That said, you could certainly hand in a journal early. That's always lovely. But by the 24th, we should all be ready. And certainly, you can use any of our class discussion and observations and your journal responses and your attendance responses throughout the course of the semester and analyzing any of these films. As you will see, these films build on one another, so knowing about the films historically means that you can reference prior films from prior times. We go into week 6, and that's the 3rd of March, and that's where we are watching a film from the 1950s, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And we're reading Chapter 2 in Projected Fears, Things from Another World, and in the Nightmares book, Chapter 4, Body Snatchers. This is also when you've got journal number 2 due on Dracula. And you'll see that starting at this point in the semester, at the ending of February, you'll have a journal due just about every week on a film that we would have viewed previously and talked about previously in class. Week 7, on the 10th of March, 1960s, we're watching Psycho, and a very famous film in the horror genre, and just a very famous film in general. And your reading is on Chapter 3, Psycho, and Projected Fears, Chapter 5, and Nightmares, California Gothic, and Chapter 12, Alfred Hitchcock, who is the director of this film, and that's the date where Cat People would be required for you to submit for your journal. Now, I had indicated that I try to choose a film for every decade, but there are places where I perhaps took some liberties. And the 1960s is a place where I took some liberties. It was an incredibly important time for horror film because while Psycho came out in 1966 and 1968, an incredibly important horror film also came out, and that is Night of the Living Dead. So I cheated a little bit here, and I have 2 horror films from the 1960s. So I took a little bit of professorial privilege here. And we will be reading Night of the Living Dead in Chapter 4 and of Projected Fears, and in Chapter 6 in Nightmares, Apocalypse, and Chapter 14, George Romero being the director of that particular film. So you can see that the way I would be structuring this class is that we would be meeting once a week, and we would spend half of the class discussing a film, and then the other half of the class watching a film. So what I will do is I will provide the conversation that we would normally have through the video and our class discussion forum, and then I will provide the links for you to watch the actual films that you will be writing about. And as we move on to the 1970s, a film that you've probably heard of, The Exorcist in 1973, that puts us at the 31st because we are not meeting on the 24th. That's a spring break, so we get a week off. And we'll be reading about The Exorcist and also the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, another important film during this time, but I chose The Exorcist, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why when we get there. And also reading in horror film about films from 1974 to the present. And that's when your Psycho journal would be due on the 31st. So when we get to April 7th, there's a little bit more cheating for me because April 7th is supposed to represent horror film from the 1980s. And instead, I've assigned a film that debuted in 1978. So that's not the 80s, but it had a huge impact on the decade of the 80s. And that film is John Carpenter's Halloween. And it led to the whole slasher genre. So again, a little bit of fudging here because the film didn't exactly come out in the 80s, but it very much is representative of the films of the 80s. So that'll be Halloween from 1978. We'll read about Halloween and we'll read a little bit about John Carpenter. And you'll have a journal on Night of the Living Dead. On the 14th is where we talk about horror film in the 1990s. And there are lots of options here, but I wanted to talk about the Blair Witch Project because I think it does a really good job in examining some of the issues of technology, since the 1990s were the early days of the internet. And it also led to the found footage movement that became very popular and still is in some ways. So we'll talk about the Blair Witch Project that came out in 1999, as well as postmodern horror and digital horrors. And that's when your journal for The Exorcist would be due. Now we're at the 21st of April, that's week 13, and we will be watching 28 Days Later. Now, this film is a film about a pandemic, and I can say that I've offered my last two horror film classes the option of not watching this film because we've been in a pandemic, and both have agreed that we should watch it because of that very reason, that we're in a pandemic. So if you have any strong objections to watching this film, let me know. But based on my prior two experiences of teaching this class during our pandemic, it's hard to believe it's gone on for so long that I could have taught two classes. But nevertheless, if you've got huge objections to 28 Days Later, which happens to be a virus that basically leads to a pandemic, or at least an epidemic, we should say. If you have objections to this film because you think it might be a trigger, let me know. But assuming that we continue on the way we have in the past with my previous classes, we'll be watching 28 Days Later to represent the 2000s. And in some ways, it's a quite prophetic film when we think about our own time period. This is when we will read the conclusion of Projected Fears, and we will also talk about spooky sounds in horror film, as we will talk about previously previous to this movie, but definitely with this movie, sound is just so important in terms of establishing mood. 28 Days Later has one of the best, I believe, soundtracks of any of the horror films that we have watched prior to that point. That's when your 8th journal is due on Halloween. Then we get to the 28th of April, and this is when we get to watch one of my favorite films, Jordan Peele's Get Out. And when we also talk about reading about the colors of fear. And this is the date on the 28th that the Blair Witch Project journal will be due. And then our last class will be basically just summing things up. And eventually, perhaps in the future, that's when I will have a horror film from the 2020s. But I can say that right now, I haven't found something that's necessarily representative of the 2020s. So our last class on the 5th of May is just our doing a sum up. You'd have two journals due during that particular class, 28 Days Later and Get Out. Again, you can always hand in your journals early. And you can see that your final exam would be scheduled at the time in which it would be scheduled if we were meeting live at GCC, which means that it would be the following class after the 5th of May, and that would be the 12th of May, Wednesday. And I will post that final at by 6, the way I would post all of our examination, or all of our videos. And you would have 24 hours in which to respond to that final exam. It's also the last day in which you can hand in your final course project. So certainly at that point, there wouldn't be any time to do a revision. And I encourage you to hand in your course project earlier. And if it turns out that you wanted to present your course project to the class, or somehow needed class involvement with your course project, that's also something we could do in that very last class on the 5th, because we don't have necessarily anything scheduled. So that gives you an overview of the class. I hope I've answered all of your questions. This would be the time where I would ask if you had any questions or concerns, please let me know. And certainly if you do have any questions or concerns, please contact me via email or voicemail or chat or Zoom, or however is comfortable to you. And I thought that for today's attendance question, I could just ask you in the discussion forum to briefly introduce yourself and to tell us a little bit about yourself, as much or as little as you'd like, so we can get a sense as to who is in the class. And again, you don't have to respond to your classmates, but I'm hopeful that you read their responses so that you can see who they are. And then next class, we can begin by talking about what horror film is and what it does, and why it appeals to certain people and why it doesn't appeal to certain people. So I hope you're all doing well. I am doing well, and I look forward to meeting with you, so to speak, next Wednesday to talk about horror film. Take care. Bye bye.